0. All right, and we're live. So let's look up here. We're going to talk about early human migration today. So early human migration, life into the Americas. Then we'll get to our society. So first off, when I look at this map right here, I can see that life begins in Africa. Homo sapiens, us modern humans, we begin in Africa. And what happens is we start spreading out. All of this spread out would have been during the hunter-gatherer phase of humanity. So all of this spread out would have been during the hunter-gatherer phase of humanity. And we see that humans leave Africa about 100,000 years ago, give or take about 5,000 years. And then we go into Europe, Asia, we keep going down to Australia, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We'll get to all these islands, which we'll talk about later. And today more of our focus is going to be on traveling through Asia and going to the Americas. Humans, from our historical records, first get to the Americas about 12,000 years ago. About 12,000 years ago. So around the year 10,000 BC is when first humans crossed into the Americas. Now, how do they get there? There are some differing theories about this. You got them? Oh, we're on a note packet. Just go to slide 1 for Americas and Oceania. All right, so what happens is they cross into the Americas. There's a couple theories. One theory, which was actually started in the 16th century, was that there was a land bridge, and this continues to be a popular theory. But there was a land bridge connecting Russia up here in Asia and Alaska here in North America, and that these hunters-gatherers were moving along, and eventually they just kind of crossed over. And if we look here, here's a close-up of, we have Russia and Alaska right here. We can see that there's not much space here, and the continents used to be connected. Now, we don't know if water levels went down and this was connected. There are other theories and hypotheses that some of the people from Russia built boats and were traveling and fishing in here, and eventually came across and then started living on this side, sort of slowly going down, and then over thousands of years went further and further down the Americas. So that is called the land bridge theory, and it pretty much explains what we have right now for evidence how people first came to live in the Americas. So from there, what happened was people kept living further and further down, and we're going to get back to the North American societies, but we're going to get into Mesoamerica, which is right around this area right here today. Mesoamerica, which we're going to talk about, which would be Mexico, Central America. So, again, over thousands of years, these people move down, and when they get to the warmer climates, especially in the area of Mesoamerica, they start building empires. They start building large civilizations. And the largest civilizations we see in the Americas are in Mesoamerica and South America. Although there were large civilizations in North America too, but the ones in Mesoamerica and South America are bigger. All right, so we're going to start by talking about the Toltecs who were mentioned in your chapter. This is where you can see where you did your reading from. The Toltecs, they were part of what we call, again, a post-classical period. From 900 AD to 1200 AD is the period we're covering right now. And the Toltecs lived in the northern, central Mexican highlands. So they lived in the highlands, north central Mexico. Now the highlands in that area are cooler. It's a cooler temperature in the highlands because as you go further in elevation, the temperature goes down. This was a civilization that was developed by nomadic farmers who eventually, just like Mesopotamia, just like Egypt, eventually settled down and grew their crops through domestication and were farming. Just like you mentioned the do now, they had agriculture. And the agriculture, a lot of it was based on irrigation. They had agriculture that was based on irrigation. But they began using something that we're going to talk a lot about the Aztecs with. They used what are called chinapas, Oops, not that guy. Chiapas, which is basically where you take land and you gain land by going into a water area. You put posts in there all around, and you put like a wood platform down there. You put mud on it, and you can grow and gain land right in a lake. So they start using it for part of their agriculture, Chiapas, and they're able to basically build land. So the Toltec used this. The Aztecs are like the masters of this, which allows you to gain land if you don't have land. It gives you a place to grow, especially if you live on an island, which we'll talk about the Aztecs in a little bit with that. So the Toltec. The Toltec they traded with a lot of the other groups around them, some nomadic, some also were settled down. And they had a capital called Tula. It was the capital of Toltec civilization from 980 AD to 1179. This was a very large city, Tula. So from 980 to 1179, Tula was a major city. And at its height, at its peak, there were 30,000 people who lived there. At its height, at its peak, there were 30,000 people who lived in Tula. It was polytheistic. It was polytheistic like many early civilizations. And it was also a theocracy. Theocracy. Theocracy, T-H-E-O. How do you begin that? Theocracy is basically when your religious people are also your rulers. So just like in Mesopotamia, where the priests were pretty much the people who were in charge at first, you had priests who were also in charge of the Toltec civilization. When you study early civilizations, you find a lot of these patterns. They often begin polytheistic. They have like priests who are in charge because they can contact the gods, the many gods that they believe in. All right, it was a militaristic empire and expanded through conflict, but also through trade. Trade made them richer, but they had a strong military which allowed the Toltec to expand. And here we see in Mexico, we see about the land where the Toltec were, where their expansion was. The Toltec eventually do fall. Why the Toltec fall, we don't quite know. We don't have written records. So why the Toltec fall, we don't know. Possibly it could have been because of loss of wealth, because of trade. They could have lost some trade. There could have been a drought. There could have been a civil war. But we don't quite know why the Toltec fall. We do know their last ruler committed suicide. The last Toltec ruler committed suicide, and that was the end of the dynasty. So there was a dynasty they had that was going on. The last ruler committed suicide, and then they kind of like fade away, and there's no central power in their area anymore. Well, that is the Toltec. We still have mysteries and need to learn more about them. Now let's move on to the next group we're going to talk about, the Mexica, which they would have called themselves. We call them typically the Aztecs, but they would have called themselves the Mexica. So the Aztecs were nomads. They arrived in the Valley of Mexico 1300 AD. The Valley of Mexico, near where you would find Mexico City today. They were not a strong group. They had to ally themselves or form alliances with more powerful cultural groups in the area. Now, they basically got chased by more powerful groups to an island. And this island was in the middle of Lake Texcoco. So they were on an island. It was a marshy island. Not a really good place to live. And they were kind of in the center of these warring groups that were fighting each other. So it's like there was no dominant power. The Aztecs were kind of pushed onto this island. And it was pretty much no one wanted it. However, it would become their strength. The story goes that the Aztec leaders, when they chose this island, one story is they were pushed there. Another story goes that Aztec, the elders, what they saw was on top of what's on the Mexican flag? An eagle doing what? Eating a snake on top of what? A cactus. That was where they decided to build their city. So an elder saw an eagle eating a snake on top of a cactus, and this is where the Aztecs decided, well, this is where we're going to live. Historians also think they didn't have a choice because there were more powerful people around them. So, the Aztecs make some alliances, but what happens is, like we talked about with the Chinapas, they become masters of using and making land around them. The Aztecs are able to enlarge their land. And the Aztecs are also able to grow more crops. And it's also very hard to attack the Aztecs on their island because you would have to sail in this very large lake. It's no longer a lake anymore. There's some canals in Mexico City today, but the lake's pretty much gone since like 20 million people live in Mexico City. So from here, they would have to go and attack them on this island, which would be very hard to do. So the Aztecs actually have a lot of advantages. They're hard to attack. And once they start growing their chinapas or growing their land, they have a surplus of agriculture, especially corn. And this allows them to grow rich in trade and also to feed their people and have a growing population. So, the Aztecs are chased onto an island. The Tepanics are pretty much the group that is mostly in powerful in the region. And the Tepanics chase the Aztecs onto their island. Well, what happens is the Tepanics eventually fall. They fall in a series of wars with other groups. And the Aztecs are able to form what's called a triple alliance. They're able to form a triple alliance with two other groups. Now, the Aztecs form this triple alliance. What slowly happens is the Aztecs become more powerful and they pretty much take over. So by the time that Hernan Cortez comes, the Aztecs are the emperor in power. Hernan Cortez was the Spanish conquistador. We'll talk about him later. So by the time the Spanish come, the Aztecs are the ones in power in the Valley of Mexico. And they have a growing empire. They have a huge city. The city on an island is called Tenochtitlan. This is a huge, major city, bigger than almost any city that would be in Europe at this time, and more advanced with the markets. When the Spanish conquistadores come in and they see Tenochtitlan, its markets and everything, they think they're in a dream because they can't believe everything that's there. There's literally conquistadores' journal entries saying like, they think they're like, this must be a dream or something because they just can't believe all the things that are in this major city, in this market, when they come into Tenochtitlan. All right. In Aztec culture, women did have fewer rights than the males. That's almost always the case in history. But the women had more rights than other neighboring civilizations. For example, some women were able to enter the priesthood, but unfortunately women weren't able to get many other jobs besides that. Marriages were arranged in Aztec culture, and they were usually arranged between the social classes, and they were often to form alliances. But Europe did this too with their kings and queens all the time. Society was pretty rigid. You were pretty much in your class where you were supposed to be, whether you were rich or whether you were a commoner. However, there were some ways you could advance, especially through fighting. Through bravery in the battlefield was a way you could advance in society. And here's something interesting. A noble. If a woman who was a noble had a baby, that baby was a noble. They were in the high class. Even if the woman married a common person. the baby